Is this new MacBook Pro with the M2 chip better than the M1 MacBook Pro? Well, obviously, yeah, it's going to be, but in this video, we're gonna go over some of the differences that there might be between these two machines, and then kind of let you know whether it's worth picking up the new M2 MacBook Pro over the M1 model. Now, I want to start by prefacing that the machines configured for this video are the base M1 and M2 MacBook Pros. They each have 8 gigabytes of RAM and 256 gigs of internal storage. These are some of the more popular versions that people buy because, well, they're the cheaper entry-level versions, but I highly recommend upgrading to at least 16 gigabytes of RAM and try to get a bit more storage if you can. I fill up 256 really easily. Now, quickly, from a design standpoint, both of these machines are literally the exact same. There's nothing different about them at all. They still have 2 USB-C ports on the left-hand side, a 3.5mm headphone jack on the right. You get the same thicker bezels compared to the larger 14 and 16-inch MacBook Pros. Obviously, there's a notch on that model, but not on these. Really, these are just the same M1 MacBook Pros from 2020, but now they have an M2 chip inside. I mean, this still has the touch bar. So in my mind, I feel like Apple just took whatever leftover supply they had of the 2020 M1 MacBook Pros and just replaced the M1 with the M2. Now, this brings us to really our only difference, and that is the M2 chip on the inside. The M2 chip is Apple's next generation Apple Silicon, and it sports some moderate upgrades over the M1. If we run Geekbench, which is a very popular app that we would use to get our benchmark score, you'll see that there's a minor improvement for the single core. I got about 8% improvement, and then a 12% improvement for multi-core scores. Now, these scores can vary. Ours were a bit on the lower side, but others have gotten anywhere from 12% for the single core and up to 20% for multi, so it's just something to keep in mind. Where the M2 really excels is the GPU department because, well, the older ones had an 8-core GPU and this new one starts with a 10-core GPU. And so that's where you're gonna get your biggest boost in performance. And the GPU benchmarks clearly show that. I mean, we got metal scores in Geekbench that are nearly 35% better than the previous model. If we go and do frame rate benchmarks like 3D Mark Wildlife, that shows us up to 40 frames per second on the M2 compared to the M1's 29 frames per second. So the benchmarks do show the benefits of that extra 2 cores of GPU power, but what about that improvement in real life? Well, for me, when exporting videos in 4K via Final Cut Pro, I did not notice much faster export times between the two machines when working with like a basic project that I would make on a regular basis. Now, if I start adding in more effects and plugins and things to my project, I noticed that the 2 extra cores kind of helped keep the export times the same as before, not so much making them faster, but just kind of keeping things in line with where they're supposed to be. And it also does a better job of managing the CPU load compared to what the M1 does, where things are starting to get a lot hotter and they're using up almost the entire 8 cores that are offered. Now, things do get a bit interesting with the base model's SSD because it appears that Apple has only included 1 NAND chip in the M2 over the dual chips found on the M1 MacBook Pro. Now, I do want to stress that this is something that's only found in the base models. The 512, the 1 terabyte, all the other extra models that you can configure on Apple's website will supposedly come with 2 NAND chips. This is just for the base model. But what we're getting with this is that the actual M1 SSD speeds are now faster than the M2 because it has that extra chip. Now, why could a slow SSD be kind of a big deal? Well, if you're running the base model MacBook Pro with an already low 8 gigabytes of RAM, your machine will need to rely on virtual memory, which will happen via your SSD read speeds, which is some of the slowest options between the two. And when you do that transfer between the hardware RAM and the virtual memory from the SSD, that could impact performance and slow things way down. Considering that your machine only has 8 gigabytes of RAM, and depending on what you throw at it, this could happen more than you think. Now, I did do a few real world tests, just a couple, and again, results could vary, but I transferred over some large files, a big 50+ gig folder, And my SSD speeds actually showed in real world performance that the M2 was actually faster than the M1. So I'm not entirely sure how or why this is happening. Other people are getting the correct results that the benchmarks show, which is that the M1 is faster in the SSD department. But again, I don't know. I think results are just going to vary. If you work with a lot of web apps, Safari or Google Chrome, Tab, documents, emails, etc., all that stuff, then this machine could do the trick, though I'd still be weary of that 8 gigabytes of RAM and the slow 256 gig SSD. But if we run a benchmark on Speedometer 2.0 to test the responsiveness and snappiness of your machine with web applications, you'll see that the M2 is outperforming the M1 by quite a bit. In fact, I ran the same test on my M1 MacBook Pro, and it actually didn't beat the M2, which is kind of crazy. Now, as far as battery life goes, during all of these tests and being under a pretty intense workflow, the battery was chugging along and burning at a much faster rate, which is obvious. Each machine was kind of lasting around the 4-hour mark. For normal tasks like working on just like web documents and emails and just things that don't require massive CPU or GPU loads, you should expect around 13 hours, give or take, of battery life for both the M2 and the M1, because it really wasn't that far behind. So if we round up, they're pretty much the same. Both have excellent battery life if you're not throwing a ton of crazy GPU or CPU intensive tasks at it for hours on end. Obviously, I'd recommend just keeping your M1 if you are an M1 owner and you are happy with it. I don't think going from an M1 to an M2 is a good idea if you're looking for more power or performance. I would say maybe try an M1 Pro or an M1 Max, or if you really need a lot, you can get the Ultra, but my guess is an M1 Pro or an M1 Max is good for most of you out there. The M2 should definitely be purchased, in my opinion, if you want a base level MacBook Pro and you're coming from an Intel machine, as I still think they're way better than Intel machines, and you don't need any more power than what was displayed in this video. I'd still recommend getting at least 512 or a terabyte of storage, and if you think you're going to be running a lot of applications at one time or a lot of tasks that could take up a bit more memory than what the 8 gigabyte base could handle, I'd recommend bumping up to 16 gigs if you can swing it. There is actually a 24 gig option, but again, depending on what you're working on, you probably won't need that much. Of course, I would love to know your thoughts in the comments down below. This has been Dan with Mac Rumors. Thanks so much for watching, and I hope to see you around in the next video.